Imagine a man so disarmingly handsome, so effortlessly charming, that he could walk into a room and make everyone feel at ease, while secretly plotting their demise. This is the story of Ted Bundy, a predator who wore a mask of normalcy so convincing that even those closest to him never saw the monster within. Theodore Robert Bundy came into the world on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont, born to Eleanor Louise Cowell, a young woman cloaked in mystery. His father's identity remains a shadow. Some whispered it was a sailor, others hinted at darker family secrets, but no one knew for sure. Raised by his grandparents in Philadelphia, Ted grew up under a strange deception. He was told his mother was his sister, a lie meant to protect him from shame, but one that left him unmoored. "I always felt like something was off," he later said, his voice cool and distant, a tone that would define him. When he was 3, Louise took him to Tacoma, Washington, where she married Johnny Bundy, a quiet cook who gave Ted his surname, but little else. "He wasn't my real dad," Ted remarked sharply, rejecting the man's attempts at connection. School was no refuge either. Ted was smart but aloof, more observer than participant. "I didn't fit in," he admitted, "so I learned to fake it." And fake it he did, crafting a persona that hid the storm brewing inside. As a teenager, Ted was a paradox. Outwardly, he was the picture of normalcy, good-looking, athletic, a Boy Scout with a paper route. But beneath that polished surface, something sinister flickered. He began stealing, not out of necessity, but for the rush. Wallets, bikes, anything he could snatch. "It was like a game," he said, his eyes narrowing with a glint of amusement. "I wanted to see if I could get away with it." He always did, sharpening a talent that would soon turn deadly. College became his stage. Enrolling at the University of Washington in 1965, he studied psychology, drawn to the workings of the mind, perhaps trying to decode his own. "I wanted to understand people," he claimed, though his curiosity felt more like a predator sizing up prey. There he met Elizabeth Klupfer, a single mother captivated by his charm. "He was perfect," she recalled wistfully. "Too perfect." They dated, but Ted's attention drifted. He'd linger in the shadows on campus, watching women, his pulse quickening. "I liked the hunt," he confessed, his smile razor-thin. The year 1974 marked his descent. Linda Ann Healy, a 21-year-old student, disappeared from her Seattle basement bedroom, her skull later found broken. Karen Sparks, 18, survived an attack, but was left with no memory of her assailant. "I don't remember his face," she whispered, her voice fragile. Bundy's approach was calculated. He'd feign vulnerability, a sling on his arm, a plea for help. "Can you give me a hand?" he'd ask, his grin warm. Once they were alone, the act dissolved and the nightmare began. His terror spread beyond Washington. Moving to Utah for law school, he left a wake of missing women. Nancy Wilcox, 16, Melissa Smith, 17, Laura Aim, 17. "He was a ghost," a detective growled, exasperated. Bundy's charm was his weapon. Questioned by police, he'd weave lies with ease. "I'm just a student," he'd say, eyes wide with feigned innocence. They let him go, and he'd vanish, smirking inwardly. In Colorado, his audacity peaked. Corinne Campbell, 23, was taken from a hotel hallway, her body discarded in the snow. "I felt invincible," he later bragged, his tone unnervingly steady. He revisited his crimes, savoring the memories. "It was like collecting trophies," he said, his detachment icy. Yet the mask wasn't flawless. In August 1975, a Utah trooper stopped him, discovering masks, handcuffs, and a crowbar in his car. "Just tools," Bundy shrugged, but suspicion lingered. Arrested for burglary, he was soon tied to a kidnapping. "I didn't do it," he protested, but evidence mounted. In 1976, he stood trial for abducting Carol Duranche, who'd narrowly escaped. "That man tried to take me," she testified, trembling. Convicted, he got 15 years. "A minor setback," he muttered, his mind already scheming. Even behind bars, Bundy's charisma held. He studied law, played the model prisoner, and planned his next move. "I'll beat this," he told his lawyer, unshaken. But his hunger gnawed at him. He'd escaped twice, once from a courthouse, once from jail, slipping into the darkness like a wraith. "I was born to be free," he said, defiance blazing in his eyes. His story was just beginning. His early crimes in Washington left a trail of missing women and baffled police, but his darkness was just beginning to unfurl. By 1974, Bundy's mask of normalcy was still intact, but his urge to kill was spiraling out of control. Ted Bundy's move to Salt Lake City in 1974 was a fresh start, or so it seemed. Enrolled in law school at the University of Utah, he played the part of the diligent student, attending lectures and blending into the campus crowd. But his studies were a facade, a thin veil over the compulsion that gnawed at him day and night. "I felt like I could go anywhere," he later said, his voice chillingly casual, as if recounting a vacation. In truth, he was hunting, his eyes scanning for the next target, his mind already plotting the details. His first Utah victim was Nancy Wilcox, 16, a bright-eyed girl with dreams of becoming a teacher. On October 2, 1974, she vanished without a trace while walking home from school. Her mother, frantic, searched the neighborhood, clutching a faded photograph of Nancy smiling in her cheerleading uniform. "She was just gone," she sobbed, her voice breaking with each word. The police found no clues, no witnesses, only an empty space where a life once bloomed. Then, on October 18th, Melissa Smith, 17, disappeared after leaving a pizza parlor with friends. Her laughter still echoed in her father's mind as he stood in her bedroom, staring at her untouched bed. "He took my baby," he whispered, his hands trembling. Her body was found 9 days later, discarded like trash in the mountains, her dreams snuffed out in an instant. 2 weeks later on Halloween, Laura Amon, 17, vanished while walking to a party. Her friends described her as the life of the group, always the first to dance, the last to leave. "She was so full of life," one said, tears streaming down her face. Bundy's pattern was clear: young, attractive women, lured by his charm or his feigned vulnerability. He'd approach them with a sling on his arm, a cast on his leg, or a stack of books he couldn't carry. "Can you help me with this?" he'd ask, his smile warm, his eyes pleading. Once they were alone, the act dissolved, and the nightmare began. In Colorado, his audacity peaked. On January 12, 1975, Corinne Campbell, 23, was taken from a hotel hallway in Snowmass while on vacation with her fiancé. "I'll never forget her scream," a witness said, shuddering at the memory. Her fiancé paced the lobby, his heart pounding, but she never returned. Weeks later, her body was found in the snow, a grim trophy of Bundy's growing boldness. He'd revisit the sites, savoring the memories like a collector admiring his prizes. "It was like collecting trophies," he later admitted, his detachment as cold as the mountain air. Despite the mounting evidence, Bundy remained a ghost. He'd change his appearance, new haircuts, fake mustaches, even altering his gait, and slip through police dragnets with ease. "I was good at being someone else," he bragged, his eyes gleaming with pride. His ability to blend in was uncanny. He'd chat with officers at roadblocks, his grin masking the monster within. "I'm just a student," he'd say, eyes wide with feigned innocence, and they'd wave him through, oblivious to the danger. His personal life was a stark contrast to his nocturnal horrors. He maintained a relationship with Elizabeth Kloepfer, who saw only the charming Ted, the man who brought her flowers, who listened to her worries. "He was so gentle," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. But cracks were forming. Kloepfer grew suspicious, noticing his late-night absences, the strange items in his car, rope, gloves, a flashlight. I didn't want to believe it, she admitted, her hands trembling as she recalled the man she thought she knew. She reported her fears to the police, but they dismissed her. "He's too clean-cut," an officer said, shaking his head. "Doesn't fit the profile." In August 1975, Bundy's luck ran out, or so it seemed. A Utah trooper stopped him for a traffic violation, discovering masks, handcuffs, and a crowbar in his car. "Just tools," Bundy shrugged, his smile tight. But the officer wasn't convinced. Arrested for burglary, Bundy was soon linked to the attempted kidnapping of Carol Duranch, who'd narrowly escaped his clutches months earlier. "That man tried to take me," she testified, her voice steady despite the terror in her eyes. Convicted in 1976, Bundy was sentenced to 15 years. "A minor setback," he muttered, his mind already plotting. Behind bars, Bundy's charm held strong. He studied law, played the model prisoner, and schemed for freedom. "I'll beat this," he told his lawyer, his confidence unshaken. But his hunger gnawed at him, a relentless itch he couldn't scratch. On June 7, 1977, he escaped from a Colorado courthouse during a recess, vanishing into the mountains. "I was free," he said, his voice alight with exhilaration. He reveled in the chase, hiding in cabins, stealing food, his heart pounding with the thrill of evasion. Recaptured, after 6 days, he planned again, his mind a steel trap. On December 30th, 1977, he slipped through a jail ceiling, his slender frame squeezing into the night. "I was born to be free," he declared, his defiance blazing like a wildfire. His escape sent shockwaves through the nation. The charming killer was loose, and his hunger was far from sated. He fled to Florida, where his mask would finally shatter. Ted Bundy's escapes from Colorado jails in 1977 unleashed a predator unbound, his hunger sharper than ever. The charming law student, whose smile had disarmed so many, was now a fugitive racing across America, leaving a trail of shattered lives. His destination, Florida, where his mask of normalcy would finally crack, revealing the monster within. Ted Bundy landed in Tallahassee, Florida, in January 1978, a ghost in a stolen car. He'd fled Colorado's jails, shedding his old life like a snake's skin. Calling himself Chris Hagen, he rented a room near Florida State University, blending into the college scene with his easy smile and stolen credit cards. "I was free to be me," he later said, his voice tinged with a chilling thrill. But freedom for Bundy meant death for others. His compulsion, once a whisper, was now a roar, driving him to hunt with reckless abandon. On January 15, 1978, he struck at the Chi Omega sorority house, a place buzzing with the laughter of young women. In the dead of night, he slipped inside, his shadow moving silently through the halls. Within minutes, Margaret Bowman, 21, and Lisa Levy, 20, were gone, their lives stolen in a frenzy of rage. 2 others, Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, survived, their screams piercing the darkness. "I saw his face," Kathy whispered later, her voice trembling. "Those eyes, like nothing human." Bundy vanished into the night, leaving chaos in his wake. The sorority sisters, once carefree, locked their doors, their trust shattered. "We thought we were safe," one said, her voice hollow. Weeks later, on February 9th, Bundy struck again in Lake City, Florida. Kimberly Leach, 12, disappeared from her school, her small frame no match for his calculated charm. "She was just a kid," her mother sobbed, clutching Kim's favorite doll. Her body was found months later, discarded in a shed, a final act of cruelty. "I wanted to keep her close," Bundy said, his tone eerily detached, as if speaking of a possession. His rampage was no longer careful. It was desperate, a predator unraveling under his own hunger. The police, once baffled by his elusiveness, were closing in. Elizabeth Klupfer, his former girlfriend, had tipped them off years earlier, her suspicions finally taken seriously. "I knew it was him," she said, her voice heavy with guilt. Witnesses described a charming stranger with a VW Beetle, a detail that matched Bundy's profile across states. On February 15, 1978, a Pensacola officer stopped him for driving a stolen car. "Who are you?" the officer demanded. "Theodore Bundy," he replied, his smirk fading as handcuffs clicked. The charming killer was caged, but his story was far from over. The evidence piled up like a house of cards collapsing. Fibers from his car matched those found on victims. Witnesses identified his face, his voice. "That's the man," Carol Durange said, pointing at him in a lineup, her hands shaking. Bundy, ever the performer, tried to play the courtroom like a stage. Arrested for the Chi Omega murders, he represented himself, his law school training giving him a veneer of competence. "I'm innocent," he declared, his eyes locking onto jurors, his charm a weapon, even in chains. But the facade was cracking. "He's too smooth," a juror whispered, uneasy under his gaze. The trial, held in Miami in June 1979, was a media circus. Televised live, it drew millions who couldn't look away from the man who seemed so normal, yet so monstrous. Prosecutors laid out a chilling case. Bite marks on Lisa Levy matched Bundy's teeth, a rare forensic link. "He left his signature," the prosecutor said, holding up a dental mold. Bundy's composure wavered. He ranted about conspiracies, his voice rising with desperation. "They're framing me," he shouted, but the evidence was ironclad. On July 24, 1979, the jury convicted him of the Chi Omega murders. "Guilty," the foreman said, and the courtroom exhaled. Sentenced to death, Bundy smirked, "I'll be back." A second trial in 1980 for Kimberly Leach's murder sealed his fate. "He took a child," the prosecutor thundered, holding up Kim's school photo. The jury took hours, not days, to convict. Another death sentence followed. "You'll never hold me," Bundy taunted, but the electric chair loomed. In prison, he played the celebrity inmate, granting interviews with a grin. "I'm just a guy who got caught," he told a reporter, his eyes gleaming with defiance. But behind the bravado, cracks showed. He confessed to dozens of murders, 30, maybe more, spilling details with a cold detachment that chilled investigators. "I did what I did," he said, shrugging, as if discussing a day at work. His confessions were a twisted bid for control, a way to delay the inevitable. "I know things you don't," he teased detectives, dangling names of victims like bait. Families wept as names surfaced. Jorgan Hawkins, Donna Manson, women whose fates had haunted them for years. "He gave us answers but no peace," a mother said, her voice raw. Bundy's charm, once his greatest weapon, was now a hollow act, fooling no one but himself. Florida's death row became his final stage. He proposed to Carol Ann Boone, a supporter, during a trial, his voice steady as she said yes. "I love him," she declared, blind to the truth. But even she drifted away as his confessions mounted. "I can't stay," she whispered, leaving him to face the end alone. The law he'd mocked was closing in, and the charming killer's time was running out. Ted Bundy, the man whose charm masked a monstrous hunger, was now caged on Florida's death row. His trials for the Chi Omega murders and Kimberly Leach's killing had stripped away his facade, exposing a predator who'd left a trail of grief across America. Yet, even behind bars, Bundy played the role of the charismatic showman, weaving lies and confessions to hold the world's attention. His time was running out, but his shadow would linger long after the end. Ted Bundy entered Florida's death row in 1979 with the same calculated charm that had lured his victims. At Rayford State Prison, he was no longer the dashing law student, but a condemned man, his cell a stark reminder of his fate. Yet he refused to fade quietly. "I'm not done yet," he told a guard, his grin as sharp as ever. He granted interviews, his voice smooth and measured, playing the misunderstood genius. "I'm just a guy who got caught," he told a reporter, his eyes gleaming with defiance. To the world, he was a puzzle, charismatic, articulate, and utterly chilling. His confessions began trickling out, a twisted bid to control his narrative. Between 1980 and 1989, he admitted to over 30 murders, though he hinted at more. "I know things you don't," he teased detectives, dangling names like bait. Jorgen Hawkins, Donna Manson, Julie Cunningham, names that brought closure to some families and reopened wounds for others. "He gave us answers, but no peace," a victim's mother said, her voice raw with grief. Bundy described his crimes with a clinical detachment that unnerved even seasoned investigators. "It was like a job," he said, shrugging. "Something I had to do." His words were a window into a mind devoid of remorse, a void where empathy should have been. Psychologists flocked to study him, drawn by the enigma of a man who seemed so normal yet was so monstrous. "He's a narcissist," one said, "thriving on control, even now." Bundy reveled in the attention, spinning tales of his childhood, his urges, his methods. "I was good at it," he said, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. He claimed his compulsion stemmed from a need to possess, to dominate. "I wanted them to stay with me," he said, his voice eerily calm. The interviews were a performance, each word calculated to keep him in the spotlight. "He's playing us," a detective muttered, slamming a tape recorder shut. His personal life unraveled alongside his confessions. Carol Ann Boone, who'd married him during his 1980 trial, stood by him at first, blinded by love. "He's innocent," she insisted, clutching his hand in court. But as his confessions piled up, her faith crumbled. "I can't stay," she whispered, leaving with their daughter, born in 1982. Bundy's a mask of charm couldn't hold her. She vanished from his life, taking their child to a quiet existence far from his shadow. "She was my last anchor," he said, his voice flat, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of loss. On death row, Bundy's health held, but his mind was a battlefield. He pored over legal texts, filing appeals to delay the inevitable. "I'm not going anywhere," he told his lawyer, his confidence unshaken. But the courts were unmoved. By 1986, his appeals were thinning, and the electric chair loomed closer. Outside, protesters gathered, some demanding his death, others fascinated by his infamy. "He's a monster," a mother shouted, holding a photo of her lost daughter. "He's a mystery," a college student countered, clutching a true crime book. As his execution neared, Bundy's facade cracked. In January 1989, with days left, he poured out more confessions, desperate to buy time. "I can give you more," he told investigators, his voice urgent. He described crimes in Washington, Utah, Colorado, Idaho. Bodies hidden in forests, mountains, rivers. "He was taunting us," a detective said, "like it was a game, so." The confessions brought some families closure, but others only pain. "I didn't want to know," a victim's sister said, her voice breaking. It made her death real again. On January 24, 1989, at 7:16 a.m., Ted Bundy faced the electric chair at Florida State Prison. "It's time," a guard said, leading him to the chamber. He walked calmly, his face pale but composed. "Tell my family I love them," he said, his final words devoid of remorse for his victims. The switch was pulled, and the charming killer was gone at 42. Outside, a crowd cheered, but others stood silent, haunted by the man who'd seemed so human, yet caused so much pain. Bundy's death didn't erase his shadow. His crimes, over 30 confirmed, perhaps dozens more, left scars across America. Families grieved daughters, sisters, friends, their lives forever altered. "He took my girl," a father said, clutching a locket with her photo. Communities locked their doors, trust eroded by a predator who'd walked among them unnoticed. "He changed how we see strangers," a Seattle resident said, her voice heavy. His legacy reshaped law enforcement. The FBI honed profiling techniques, learning from Bundy's ability to blend in. "He was the blueprint," an agent said, studying his file. "We had to get smarter." The term serial killer entered the lexicon, partly because of him. His case spurred advances in forensics, bite mark evidence, fiber analysis, tools that caught others like him. "He forced us to evolve," a detective noted, but at what cost? Hollywood and media couldn't resist. Films like The Deliberate Stranger and Extremely Wicked, shockingly evil and vile, painted him as a charismatic devil, his face plastered on screens and book covers. "He's the monster we can't stop watching," a director said, counting box office receipts. True crime fans pored over his interviews, drawn to the enigma of a man who seems so normal. "He's fascinating because he's us," a writer mused, or could have been. Bundy's shadow lingers in the questions he left behind. What turns a man into a monster? How does charm hide such darkness? "He showed us the evil in plain sight," a psychologist said, "and we're still trying to understand." His grave, unmarked, offers no answers, but his name endures, a chilling reminder that the most dangerous predators wear the kindest faces.